Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of the Research Notes. Our guest today is Leslie Fungai Mudimu, a development and systems change consultant who is driven by a passion to understand and find solutions to Africa's developmental issues. She has a multidisciplinary background, particularly in the social sciences, which enables her, of course, to better understand a wide range of complex social problems. She has conducted academic research on the inclusion of women in transitional processes and governance within the context of Zimbabwe, and her expertise currently is aligned with decolonization transformation efforts, as well as the representation and inclusion of women. Beyond working in the international development space, Leslie is the founder of a mentorship network for humanities students in South Africa and Zimbabwe. Leslie, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Thank you for having me. I'm good and I'm very excited for this conversation.
Amazing. And I'm excited to have you. And I know that you've got a rich set of, skills and knowledge you're about to impart to our listeners and viewers. So just to
Mhm.
kick off, can you tell us a bit about your academic background in terms of what did you study and where did you study as well?
Right, thanks. So I did my undergraduate studies at University of Cape Town from 2014 until 2016. And I triple majored in international relations, history, and politics. And then after that, I did my honors program from 2017 until 2018 at UCT.
Mhm.
And my specialization was justice and transformation. And it was really an opportunity to kind of make my own honors degree. So I picked majors within politics, history, and also law. And then for my master's, I moved to the University of Witwatersrand, Wits University, and I did my master's from 2019 and I graduated in 2020. My master's was in development studies. And yeah, in terms of like my research focus during my honors research was on the inclusion of women in the land reform process. So just a critical analysis of that transitional process and, the intentionality of the inclusion of women and to what extent women benefited from the land reform in Zimbabwe. And then my master's research looked at the gender quota in Zimbabwe, and I looked at party policies and party habits in promoting the gender quota in Zimbabwe. And my case study at the time was the former MDC, which was the main opposition at the time.
Amazing. Congratulations on all these accolades. And it's nice that you've crafted your own academic journey and that presents the beauty of, the humanities, where when you're doing your honors, you were able to pick up courses from different departments, including law and politics. And also traditionally doing research that not many people would think about as they enter a master's program and looking particularly at your home context, which is Zimbabwe. So really, it's good. I hope people go out there and look out for your works and hope you speak a bit about that later on today. However, our focus today is very unique because, you volunteered to engage with me in a discussion around the concept of decolonization. Many of us, know about African countries gaining independence, that were formerly colonized, but haven't followed up on what is happening right now and how we need to think about the way forward using this concept, decolonization. So, personally, how would you conceptualize the concept?
Okay. So the interesting thing is I've had a relationship with the concept of decolonization from an academic perspective and
Mhm.
now more practically with my career. So from an academic perspective, in my third year at UCT, I took a course called, at the time it was Politics of the Global South.
Mhm.
And it basically focused on the decolonization movement that happened on the continent, especially starting in the 1960s, and also
Mm.
looked at, the foundations of decolonization. So also like focusing on some of the teachings of Marcus Garvey, for example, and that influence on, African politicians on the continent and their understanding of decolonization. So in that course, I remember looking at decolonization from the perspective of knowledge production, and it also coincided with my time at UCT and with the Fees Must Fall movement and the Roads Must Fall movement, where we were speaking about decolonizing institutions. So initially, my perspective of decolonization was on decolonization, the academic space, forefronting African perspectives, forefronting African researchers, and also conducting research from the opposite of a very Eurocentric point of view. So it was also about looking at the mainstream pieces of knowledge, and how they conceptualize Africa, and how we are also saying that no, these are not correct conceptualizations of our continent, but it's rooted in a very pre-colonial mindset of, Africa being highly dependent, Africa being, a bit more backward, for example. So moving along with my career, right, the idea and the conceptualization of decolonization has also broadened. And in the work that I've done in the international development space, decolonization has also become about dismantling power structures that are a continuation of colonial, or a remnant of colonial issues. I'll give a perfect example of some of the work that I've done. And we look at decolonizing institutions. A lot of the organizations or agencies that work in the development or humanitarian space are organizations that started probably like peak colonial times or are remnants of that. So the foundation of the work that they do, especially in Africa, is rooted in this idea of we are saving Africa, that savior complex that came with, like, for example, the missionary expeditions that led to colonization in Africa. So when we look at decolonization in the development space, we're saying those institutions need to look inward. They need to look at the history of their organizations and the fundamentals that govern how they relate and work in Africa and with Africa. So instead of working in a system where you are defining development issues for Africa, it's more about how do you transform your working relationship to a point where you understand that African countries and African agencies as well have agency and know what African-centered development is for them. In addition to that, we're also looking at structural changes within organizations. I can tell you that, after the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a huge shift of organizations also looking inward, looking at their power structures, looking at, the composition of their teams, and even looking at, how are Black people or versus white people supervised in an organization, their career trajectory, etc. So now decolonization as well is looking at to what extent are you equally sharing the power? So there's common terminologies used in the development space that speaks about power shift, shifting the power, because it's now about removing majority power from, white ownership or white development practitioners, but now being more inclusive of African and Black practitioners. So those are some of like the changes that I've seen in my own perception of decolonization. So it's still, I feel there's still a thread when it comes to the academic, but practically there's so much that relates to decolonization. Essentially, it's transformation. Essentially, it's changing your approaches to engaging Africa, changing your approaches in intervening in Africa's issues, but very much being more African-led and African-centered.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that wholesome contribution. And, the reality is that decolonization is an approach that's required in multiple centers. You've mentioned, for example, in academia, and you were one of the few students that perhaps got to learn how to particularly use African authors, African insights, those that actually promote, the decolonial perspective, and taking it now into the world of work. I think it's important for people in multiple sectors. You can include computer science, engineering, and whatnot, because those are some of the areas where they're sort of like blind to the idea that we live in this,
Yes.
space where coloniality rules, and rules governing what is development and how to shape spaces also rely heavily on, what has always been done, because they don't see any problem with it, and just simply transferring those approaches to different development initiatives. So you've been in the spaces that are welcoming. If you give an overview, would you say that this concept, of forefronting Africa is something that is being deliberately taken up broadly within the intergovernmental sector or within NGOs?
That's a great question. And it aligns perfectly with where my career's at this point
Mm,
and the work that I'm currently doing and have been doing. So I would say it's been a very much a moment of pause, reflect, interrogate your own positionality, interrogate
mm,
the work you're doing in the international development space, and, and especially interrogate the relationships you have with the communities that you're working with.
mm,
So, post COVID-19, we did see a huge shift in organizations now being more intentional to say, okay, how do we partner with, local communities, African organizations? And I'm speaking from the perspective of the international development agencies,
yes.
and also we saw a huge shift in we need to partner more with grassroots level organizations. So some of the work that I've also been a part of has been focused on localization, and localization is a policy that, it falls under the huge umbrella of decolonization in the
Mhm.
development space. And with localization, the focus is we want to work with the organizations on the ground. We want to work with the NGOs, the small NGOs, the grassroots advocacy agents that have not had access to the table, with these bigger
Mm,
funding opportunities, for example. Now, as much as there is some progress and some shifts, and I'll speak a little bit about an example of some work that I once did and a project I was on that focused on that, I still think there's more that can be done.
yes.
I think this is exactly why there's still opportunities for us to continue having these conversations and why I was so excited to be part of this conversation. So, for example, I was recently, part of the development and the launch of a series of dialogues that focus on how to actually fast track decolonization.
Mm,
And the main thing we're focusing on right now is localization and making a case for basically saying African organizations need to work more together, need to work in partnership so that they can have access to, funding issues. Well, I mean, funding opportunities. So, for example, if you're a larger organization that has more buying power, you ensure that you partner with a local level organization or
mm,
grassroots organization that brings in, maybe they have you have capacity development expertise, they have the policy research, or they actually have on the ground interaction. We are trying to promote that African organizations work better together so that you don't have, let's say, five main organizations being the ones that represent the
mm,
country, when it comes to conversations with international donors. So that's another example. And then I was also part of some work to actually reimagine the INGO sector. And it's a movement that's called Ringo, still very much ongoing. And they speak about, localization. They speak about, even changing the language in development and making it more accessible to people, making it more accessible to African practitioners who might not, speak English so well, but
yeah.
understand the concepts and understand what needs to be done. And also even shifting the dynamic of how do organizations get access to funding, who is prioritized, and also making funding equitable. So also allowing opportunities for, smaller organizations that might not have the capacity. How do they get access to funding and ensure that also funding is distributed in a fair and just way where it actually goes to the communities that are on the ground and do the work. So there's still so much that can be done. And this is why this work excites me as well and why I think decolonization is still important. And I know I think it was in 2022 or was it 2023, Bond UK released a report where they were saying they're seeing a bit more stagnancy in decolonization because
Mm,
organizations are now more inward looking and are now focused on their own internal transformation. And to an extent, have neglected the transformation of the development sector. And also when you couple that with, now there's probably going to be reduced funding, especially directed to Africa. We need to really rethink how do we make sure that decolonization stays on the agenda and how do
mm.
we ensure that we can still make progress with what we had started post COVID-19, especially within the means and the resources that are going to be funneled towards international development.
Great. Thank you so much. And I'm glad that there's ongoing research to actually check on the impact of these initiatives. Because one of my questions was going to be, we need to do an empirical study into communities that have been part of these partnerships and also, to gain their
Yeah.
insights on how they think this has helped and whether or not they actually think those approaches have been inclusive to the end that we can like measure that there were decolonial intentions and actually the needs of the people on the
Mhm.
ground and their knowledge, their skills, and their expertise are also being taken into
Yeah.
consideration. So,
If you don't mind, I just want to add something to the point you've just mentioned.
yes,
Impact studies and impact evaluations are very much necessary in every like developmental process that you take on. And I think something that needs to be said as well. I mean, you'd think it goes without saying, but things like transformation and decolonization are things that take time. So you're not going
mm,
to implement a process and you have results in 3 months. You actually need to take time to, because you're shifting people's mindsets. You're also shifting normal ways of working that people have had for a long time. So
mm,
I recall one of the pieces of work I did. I was on a project team that was working with MSF Southern Africa to dismantle structural racism in their organization. And
yes,
that was a 4 year process
wow.
because you had to dig deep, understand what are the mental
Mhm.
models that are enabling racism. What are, some of the ways that racism is manifesting? How is it impacting people? And it was a very long process because you actually need to get to the roots of some of these issues if you want to achieve success. And by the time I left that project, I think by that time they had even created a dismantling structural racism unit because they realized that this work is not just a once off project. Like,
Definitely.
we need to
Mm,
continue making those efforts. So I think also it goes with that. I feel like it's something that needs to be emphasized that decolonization takes time, those shifts take time, and we also need to be patient with the process.
right. So I'm going to shift you away a bit from, NGOs, international NGOs, to speaking about the structures that guide us. We got into this world of states and we've got our leaders. On the African continent, we do have the African Union, which I think still has potential to guide us and to represent us and to bring leaders and thinkers together. How do you think this body can work towards, a collectively driven approach to decolonization? This is coming from me thinking that they haven't done much.
Okay, and I don't think it's a false premise to have. I wouldn't say, and I would actually say it's more about there's still so much more to do. I
Okay,
think
there's still so
there's
much.
there's in yeah there's endless possibilities of what can be done. And it's interesting you asked this question because at the moment I've been engaging with I know this year is the African Union's theme is education, and
Mhm.
I read through a couple of proposals about one of the things about how they want to transform education and some of the reforms they want to bring, just to make education more fit for purpose, make
Yes.
education more aligned with the job markets. And as I read through these documents, the first thing that came to mind was where is the angle about also decolonizing education?
True.
Just to rewind again, to bring it back to some of the main calls for transformation that were parts parts and parcel of, for example, the Roads Must Fall movement. We need to decolonize our institutions because that's where it all starts, right?
Mm.
So I actually have an article that's coming out soon that speaks about, that like education and that being the theme for the African Union for the year and why decolonization must be included when it comes to education. And, I'm excited to also share that with you. But anyway, to the broader question of the African Union, I think the main issue we might have is that when it comes to continental issues, you
Mhm.
have more pressing issues that take the forefront. For example, economic development, social development, and political development, and especially issues around peace and security.
Yes.
So you end up seeing that decolonization takes a bit of a back burner. And I'm here to say that I think it's something that can be included in everything that we're trying to achieve on
Mhm.
the continent, especially as we work towards Agenda 2063. For example, some of the economic issues that we face in Africa, our access or lack thereof to things like climate financing, or even some of the impact of like debt, how debt is structured when it comes to Africa. The reason
Mm.
why some of those things are the way they are is because there hasn't been any reform to those institutions or those structures. And there you see decolonization comes in. How do we change how, Africa accesses financing? How do we change how Africa is included in whatever financial mechanisms for climate change, or actually
Mm.
prioritized as the continent that's facing the most impact of climate change, despite, being responsible for very little of the, current carbon emissions, as an example. So the problem is I think we would probably see decolonization. It's so separate or even not important when we look at the agenda of the things that we need to deal with as a continent. Another example is even peace and security issues.
Yeah.
Currently, my team and I are working on a policy brief that looks into, why we need to localize peacekeeping and humanitarian aid interventions. Making a case as well of the significance of the African Union as a body that can, how they can impact transformation and peacekeeping and humanitarian aid, but also making a call for humanitarian agencies to say, come into the space where you're trying to, provide aid in the African context, but do not do it in a silo, separate from what
Mm.
the AU can do or what, local agencies can do. Why not collaborate and work more with the African Union? Because the African Union has the structures and the capacity. So I think if we actually bring in the decolonization perspective across some of the things that are on the African agenda, you'll find it applies across so many issues, and there's no need for it to be separate from the things we have on the agenda. We can still have it as part of the agenda. Just make sure it requires intentionality to say,
Mhm.
we really want to transform Africa. And maybe some of the issues that it's still facing are tied to the colonial institutions. So let's do the transformation as well to make sure we make progress.
Nice. Thank you so much for those recommendations. And one thing I always say about such institutions, especially the AU from my observation, is that
Mm-hmm.
it usually needs someone who's big, who actually incorporates the concept and preaches it to the rest. There's a time when we had the late Robert Mugabe, there's a time when we had Muammar Gaddafi, there's a time when we had Thabo Mbeki, more recently Paul Kagame. So I think we'll need to go behind such a person and be like, you know what, as you speak about revising and implementing new ways of moving forward in Africa, let's take this on. In addition, of course, to making sure that it does go into the agenda. I do acknowledge that politics is all about, the competing interests and the
Mm-hmm.
prioritization of what is perceived as what's needed. After all, these politicians have to be elected and they have to be accountable for certain indicators. But I don't think that, decolonization in terms of emphasizing it as an approach should be sidelined. It could be taken
Yeah.
back to ministers of education, ministers in different other sectors to show the
Mm-hmm.
willingness. In the same way, we've
Mm-hmm.
tried, to ensure that we preach about Pan-Africanism, which I think, is not so divorced from decolonization.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And also just thinking about, I like the point you raised about ensuring that the AU, for example, can use its collective bargaining power to advocate for better climate financing because we are hardest hit by some of the impacts of this climate change in as much as we didn't contribute or still don't contribute much to the root causes of these challenges. And I hope that we move towards a space where there's also greater accountability of those sectors which are outside the African continent.
Yeah, just as a last point, as you're speaking, something as well came up to mind. Like the example of the AFCFTA, it's about
Mm.
movement, right? It's
Yes.
about trade, it's about easier um, mobility between African states. I feel like that's not far removed from decolonization.
Hmm.
The borders and the boundaries that we use at the moment were colonially imposed on us, right?
Yes.
And now here we've come up with, this trade agreement or this, the intention is to be able to move between states easier. I don't think that's far removed from decolonization. In fact, if we were actually so intentional about it, we could see the gains that it could have for us as a continent, for better alignment when it comes to
Mm.
economic activities. And, I think it could actually even be useful to our own socioeconomic development as a continent. So it was just another example I wanted to add. Yeah.
Great. So there's no development without decolonization. And I think this even applies to citizens on the ground because some people don't actually see or perceive the benefits of, opening up borders and opening up for the markets, which is for the greater good. There have been strides, I think, in parts of East and West Africa. Of course, West Africa, there will be some regression now with some countries pulling out of partnerships. But I do think, there's room for that. And I also think it requires societies to just have this perspective as well, because their buy-in is required and their
Mhm.
use of those advantages when they've been put in place is also very important. So hopefully your work is also going to take you into more communities, into spaces that require you to speak to different people who are in different parts of society, including young people, because of course they will have to take on this challenge of ensuring that as we move on, we continue to tackle coloniality, because those that have the most power are not going to have a larger interest in your transformation and making sure that you stayed forefront. I stand to be corrected, Africa and African issues. All
Mhm.
right. So I always put myself on the hot seat in these conversations and ask
Ooh.
interviewees to ask me a question or questions if they've got any. So would you like to ask me something?
Yeah, sure. But I already feel like I might have given you some ideas of how to answer.
Okay.
But I'm interested to know, like, how would you define decolonization? And especially, I know you know your field of expertise as well, dabbles with international relations. How would you define decolonization, and how would you apply that definition in international relations?
Okay, great. Let me take this. So I think for me, decolonization is about deliberately looking at how the current world system is structured, particularly in terms of the economic system, right? Because it leads us to understanding why, for example, certain countries still regulate what happens in the area of trade, whether you're looking at tariffs, pricing, and also the trends and the demands of particular products. And you'll see that we are usually not on the winning side. Here I'm speaking about, Africa. And there's always the reference to we are maintaining the patterns that were created during colonialism, to say we were supposed to be the sources for markets in Europe and now in America, China, and other parts of the world. So I think for me, when you're speaking about international relations, it's about in whatever institution you're in, trying to make sure that you are bargaining towards dismantling the structures that are the root cause of that. But also, there's the duty of you creating incentives to have your own types of markets, your own types of economies. And our tragedy is that in most of our regions, we do the same thing. Like if I look at Southern Africa, it's easy to sideline Zimbabwe because what is in Zimbabwe can be found in Zambia, South Africa, to some extent Malawi or Mozambique. And so I think that's also the same with countries that produce cocoa, right? There's no core demand for these produce. So to actually be willing to think about how to create this African market and think about how to actually exchange within, because at the end of the day, if you're exchanging within and improve your systems, you can improve how you trade within each other, transporting within each other's regions and whatnot. So I think it also involves looking at ways in which you can work with the systems that have already been set. Because if it's the reality that it's faster to transport goods elsewhere outside the continent than within the continent, because you've created barriers that have nothing to do, with technicalities, then there's something you need to do yourself instead of just continuing to blame the systems or the borders that were put in place. So I also think that decolonial approaches are also supposed to also look back at the laws, our constitutions. I think the bulk of them are still very much mimicry of what was set by colonial administrators. And I think going back there will help us also even in identifying ways in which we lag behind, why rural communities are the way they are, and maybe they are the least to be developed in particular ways, right? I think back in the day we had systems that were more communal that we can actually still maintain, because I think mentally a lot of Africans are still communal. People go abroad, still send money back, and all these other projects. So I think also trying to tap into what we've always done and not to get away from it so that Africa doesn't look when it's developed like a developed let's say, country in Europe. So I think decolonization also, just in addition, I mentioned the law, I mentioned in terms of governments and in international relations. I think to also think deeper about how some inequalities were perpetuated by, for example, accepting that women are lesser than, women should be paid less, women should do more care work, underpaid or unpaid, because that still sets us back. And it was created by the capitalism that was so strong that it required that, for certain societies and families to be set up in particular ways. So, in as much as sometimes we blame our own cultures, I think there's room to also look at how capitalism came with this colonial era and has continued in terms of dividing labor and demanding that our countries look a certain way in terms of our social and economic setups. I hope that rambling manages to answer part of your question.
It does. And I hope I can ask a second one because now I want to catch your opinion on something.
All right, there's room for that, definitely.
Okay, cool. The second question I thought of asking you about. So, what is your what is your impression about the African Union joining the G20? Well, now we're going to call it the G21. We spoke about, transforming in international institutions. And, I think, you kind of made a link there between decolonization and multilateralism. So I'd love to
Mm.
just pick your brain about, what do you think about the AU joining the G20? Should we be positive? Should we have any sort of like ambitions for the membership and that it will benefit Africa?
Okay. I like being an Afro pessimist most of the time, but I'll try to be pragmatic and be like sitting on the fence somehow. For me, I think the major win comes with not just having, for example, South Africa as the face of Africa. They've got amazing foreign policy approaches, kudos to them. But I do think that it makes Africa think harder about what it has to bring when it's presenting, collective proposals or approaches within bodies such as this. There'll obviously be an exchange of leaders and what they have to represent. So I think it's a great opportunity in terms of entering into bigger spaces when it comes to multilateral cooperation. However, I do think that Africa is a major bloc with multiple challenges and approaches. And it may be the case that we might end up focusing on just one or a few issues, usually the ones that are proposed by bigger entities within the G20. So I don't think it's a space within we can gain much leverage, at least in the short term. And I also feel like we, to some extent, will be owing those that promoted our entry into the space, some favors. That's the reality of international relations, why I love it and why I also hate it. So I think for now, I would rather watch the space, but also for us as observers and analysts to look at the AU and what it does within the next few years and actually speak to them about what they could have done differently and applaud them where they do, introduce what works better for the African continent.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks.
All right, amazing. So I don't know if you've got any other last questions, but something came to mind, and I think it would be unfair for me not to ask. You did
Yeah.
your master's thesis focused on women in politics, and also you did mention that you also look at how women are, involved in particular projects. I don't want to assume that just because you're a woman, that's why you're doing this. But what is it about women that you continue to carry within your work and why?
Wow, that is a very good question. And I actually haven't interrogated that in a very long time. So
Mm,
yeah, it's also like a, by the way, why are you still focused on women? I think firstly, the call to do that came
hmm.
from, my own personal feminist ideology and feminist politics.
Yes.
And, growing up in a country like Zimbabwe that's very much patriarchal and where as much as women are qualified, they still have to work twice as hard or deal with, so many conflicting, you know, ideologies about women and,
Mm-hmm.
misogyny, etc. That really was the main thing that motivated me to say, you know what, I want to look at women's position. I want to look at, what needs to change for women. I will say, like, there's been a bit of stagnancy in,
Mm-hmm.
that commitment to follow through with that commitment. And I think, I don't know if it's stagnancy or despondency. I'm not sure which term is more applicable.
Yes.
But, for example, there was a time when I was so much interested in, Zimbabwean politics, women's role in Zimbabwean politics. I um, was very active in, assessing the 2018 elections and,
Mm-hmm.
some of the gains that happened for women and some of the ones that didn't. But I think, unfortunately, the reason why I'm saying I don't know if it's despondency is you make a bit of progress and then there's also like such a regression. So it's
Yes.
those things that I'm glad you asked that question because I really need to now interrogate at the place that I'm
Mm-hmm.
at in my life, considering the context of, what has been happening in my home country. What does that mean now for the work that I want to do, especially when it comes to women and gender? But at the
Mm.
end of the day, I still feel the reason why I feel it's important is I always state that women are the ones who least benefit, when it comes to are the most impacted actually
Mm-hmm.
by socioeconomic crises, by political crises.
Yeah.
Women and children and other vulnerable communities are the most impacted. And because they continue to be impacted so much, I think we continue the necessity of, being very much inclusive and being very intentional about, gender inclusion and applying a gender lens doesn't lose its merit because in whatever issue, whether it's instability, peace and security issues, you find that, women and children and other vulnerable communities are
Mm.
impacted. So you have to continue putting them on the forefront intentionally. When we talk about reforming or transforming food systems, that's important because, women are at the forefront of feeding the nation, they work the land, they're also responsible for managing nutrition needs, etc. So yeah.
Great. I think I would call it a pause. And I think that it's not that you're not focusing on it. It's just that the projects you're looking at maybe don't like define it as this is a feminist initiative or this is about women and gender. But in many ways, you are doing it. And also, in terms of your experience, what you share, and also your
Mm-hmm.
deliberations at different tables. Yeah. So I also think it's very important because what happens with academics or experts, they want to be an expert in one thing. So people will run with decoloniality. That's my thing. Even though, yes, they do appreciate that they are feminist concerns that come in, it's rare to find someone who takes up different concepts or approaches. So I think it's very important. And also the research you've already done will help us. It's historical. We need to understand why there's even fewer women now in Zimbabwean politics, perhaps more so in like opposition politics. Those insights will always be helpful. And I think personally as a Zimbabwean, I do have moments when I just need to take a breather away, come back,
Yes.
step in again. It's all part of, I think, just being a Zimbabwean citizen, of my
Yeah.
generation. So yeah, I really wish to engage with you further on this and other topics.
I was just going to say, you said something actually that's, I think, so groundbreaking, well, for me personally, because
Okay.
you said, sometimes people want to focus on one thing and become an expert in that one thing. And the funny thing
Mm.
is, I've had the opposite feeling where I feel like because I have such a multidisciplinary background and
Mm-hmm.
I really can fit into anything because I've done history, a bit of like women's rights law,
Mm-hmm.
politics, IR, even sociology. I sometimes feel like I'm too broad, like I don't have a niche. I don't have
Yes.
a specific focus, But at the
Mm.
same time, I do think the knowledge I have and, the perspective and the insights I have can be useful across disciplines, it just
Definitely.
across disciplines, across development initiatives, even across organizations. But I've felt the pressure of actually being like what's your thing? What's your niche? But hearing you saying, actually, that's a problem as well, that, you know,
Yes.
so,
Yeah.
okay, interesting.
But I mean, I think, like I said, sometimes you've got times when you focus on specific projects, but that doesn't mean you've divorced yourself from the other commitments and everything else that you're aware of. I mean, we go into
Yeah.
space and people ask, what do you do? And we live in a society, we have to curate our 1 minute intro speeches or whatever it is, pitch. So it depending on where you go, I'm sure the bio I presented, another bio you'd present in another space. So I think that's just how things are. And I think what it means for us is also the reality that people that often have power, we've spoken about countries that benefit from coloniality. Patriarchy is dominant, right? Those who benefit the most are least likely to push forward this agenda. So we have many layers of work that we may have to do. So, as I was saying, I think the reality is that, depending on what systems privilege or oppress you, that usually guides, your mission in life and your objectives, which is why you also mentioned, reflecting on your positionality. So that might be, part of the broader reason of why you've been doing the work you do in a particular way, and that you've been intentional about it. So, Leslie, thank you so much once again for joining us today and contributing to a very important set of conversations about what is happening across and beyond the continent. It was nice having you here today. And once again, to the viewers and listeners, I'm Dr. Primrose ZJ Bima. I'm on a mission to demystify the world of research through a wide set of conversations with intellectuals, industry professionals, and creators. It's goodbye for now.